record. Okay. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Welcome. And Rabbi Min, it's great to have you. So glad you're here. Thank you. And I'm going to just turn it right over to you.
Okay, well, hello everyone, and I can start by saying Shabbat Shalom and Chodesh Tov because it's Rosh Chodesh Adar, and they say when Adar comes in, joy increases. So, despite what might be happening in the world, we can smile because it's Adar. Um, and I want to start with the prayer for studying Torah. So if you know it, join me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. To engage with, to soak ourselves in, to be actively involved with the words of Torah, the things of Torah. And so let's dive in with that. Let me say that I love questions. And if you have a question, please don't hesitate to ask it. We'll come around. Can't guarantee I have all the answers. If I have any, we'll be delighted. So, this week's Torah portion that I wanted to talk about is Terumah. And Terumah has a lot of stuff in this Torah portion. It contains some very familiar sections and instructions and lists of all kinds of details. And so I'm just going to quickly review some of what's in it and then delve more deeply into some parts that caught my attention as I was preparing for this. So, as some of you know, I love Hebrew. I love the language, and I love the fact that there's so much that's buried in it. Um, and the words help us engage with the meanings that are hidden underneath it. So this portion is about donations. The title of the parsha, Terumah, comes from the Hebrew root resh mem he, and that root resh mem he generally conveys the idea of elevating or lifting up. It kind of reflects the concept of setting something aside for a higher purpose. That's why we're talking about raising it up and offering it to God, setting it aside for a higher purpose. So the word Terumah means an offering or a contribution or a donation in a religious or sacrificial context, like a portion of produce or goods or something like that is given for a sacred purpose and then raised up. So we come across this word in another form when we're parading around with the Torah, singing Ramamu, Ramamu. That word Ram means to offer up. Just like the towns in Israel that are located at higher elevations, also, they reflect that same root, that same shoresh. Think of Ramat Gan or Ramat Rachel, higher places. So the Torah portion this week describes lots of things about these donations. Some of the things it doesn't talk about is why are they necessary? Um, where do they go? What are they? It does talk about some of that in some detail, but what I want to do is select just a few verses from this parsha and then break them down in some detail. So we're going to start with Exodus 25:1. And let me see if I can screen share that verse. I know it's possible because we did a practice. Just have to find that piece of the stacks of stuff on the computer that are all fighting with each other. Okay, can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, so the first verse, Exodus 25:1, says, Daber el b'nei Yisrael, v'chuli teruma I'll call ish asher yidvenu libo tichu et trumati. So this is God speaking to Moshe and telling Moshe, speak to the children of Israel that they may take me a raised contribution. So you see this word terumah, which is usually translated as donation or contribution, but it has that same root, ra, ma, in the middle, which is why it's translated as raised contribution. From every man whose heart makes him willing, you are to take my contribution. Now, this particular translation is from Everett Fox, which is a translation that I prefer because the English clearly reflects some of the ideas that are buried inside the Hebrew. So when they call it a raised contribution in English, they're including that concept of raising up or elevation in the English translation. Most other English translations just say contribution or donation. And the Everett Fox translation does a very good job. This from every man whose heart makes him willing. So Everett Fox again has playing with the language, makes up this English, makes him willing. I've never seen that word before. He, I'm sure, created it. But he wanted to somehow express the idea that's buried in the Hebrew that this is a voluntary donation from the heart. This is clearly not a required tax. But it's an opportunity really for each person to look inside themselves and examine their willingness to contribute. And so that just in that, it's immediately connecting the physical idea of a physical contribution or a physical donation of one kind with the spiritual aspect of this has got to come from the heart. The medieval commentator Rambam says that the use of the word Terumah implies that this is something that each person is to set aside from their own belongings. You don't go out and buy something special or acquire something special for this contribution. It's supposed to be something that you already have. So it's an opportunity to look at what is important or what is perhaps even precious to you. So think about a raised contribution. What is being raised is dedicated to some higher purpose, not just to purchase any old building materials. Then the Parsha continues by listing a whole set of acceptable gifts. Goes on for 5 verses. All of these donations are described in great detail. And interestingly, they're all of very high economic value to people. They're, not just something that maybe you have a sentimental attachment to, but they're something that would be valuable, especially to this group of people who are continuing their journey, wandering in the desert. Without any clear destination or any clear purpose, these people are being directed to part with some of their valued possessions without any knowledge or hint of where they're going to, what's going on. They're interesting to me that God does not yet tell Moshe what these contributions are for. Starts out by saying, got to make this contribution, got to make this donation from your heart. And so God doesn't tell Moshe what they're for. And then, of course, Moshe doesn't tell the people what the donations are for. And then it goes on from there. And so one of the questions that came up for me is, how do we deal with that? we're asked for donations for things all the time. And usually those asks are designed to pull at our hearts in some way. Donate to the foundation that is supporting research into X and such disease. Donate for this nonprofit that is doing good work in the world. Donate to this entity whose mission you want to support. But here, the people are being asked to donate something of value that moves them without knowing what it is. So, just general question for everyone here: would you donate to something without knowing really what it was for?
Probably not.
Right, and that's exactly what Moshe is doing. Um, so I thought that was very interesting, and I kind of had not really recognized before that the ask happened before the explanation. So the then it goes on after this long list of gold and silver and all of this other stuff. So one thing about this list of suggested contributions is they include things that are valuable just in and of themselves, like gold that has some financial intrinsic value. But it also includes things that are worked, that have been transformed through the intervention of humans, artists or non-artists, to become something else. And I think in some ways that's telling us that there's at least two categories of things that we value. We value things that have been touched by other humans and improved in some way by other humans. It's the concept of kidur mitzvah, to beautify the mitzvah. And we do this all the time when we decide which of these 6 beautiful menorahs we're going to use for this Hanukkah, or we decide to buy a new one, or when we set the table with special wine glasses for Shabbat or something. So that's the concept of doing that. So these contributions can include things that have value in and of themselves and thus have value for financial exchange. But also, since they're connecting it with the concept of being moved, being willing in your heart to part with these possessions, it's really cluing into the relationship between our spiritual attachments and our physical attachments. So we're being asked to examine ourselves from a spiritual point of view. What object or objects that are currently in my possession might bring me closer to a spiritual experience in some way. So I mentioned the whole idea of what's a bridge between a physical object and a spiritual experience. So the next verse that happens after this list of objects, I'll see if I can do a screen share of that one. Here we go. So Exodus 25:8. So this is the first verse that follows this list of 5 or 6 verses that are all details of what kinds of offerings there are. V'asili mikdash, and let them make me a sanctuary. So if you look at this part of the word mikdash, you notice that it has a very familiar root, kedusha, and it's for everything that we look at as holiness. The whole concept of holiness, all of the words that have to do with holiness that I know of have those three letters in that order, kedusha. The root of these words comes up with kadosh, with kiddush, with kedusha, all of those derived from the basic concept of holiness. The mem prefix before it turns this word into that which is holy. And that's the same kind of linguistic trick that happens. I'll give you a couple examples from modern Hebrew. The word kar, which means cold, put a mem in front of it, makarer, and that's the word for refrigerator. The thing that is makes something cold, or the word for to think. Anyone know what the word is to think? Hoshet. So makshev. This is that's what a computer is. That which thinks. So it's the same kind of linguistic trick that is done here. Although in modern Hebrew, they tend to call it laptop. Anyway, so let's look at that verse. The Shahanti, oh, I'm not there yet, for Asuli Mikdash. So then Mikdash gets to be translated as sanctuary, but it really, looking directly at the Hebrew, is something holy. Make me something holy. And then the rest of the verse continues. The Shachanti v'tocham. So this first word of this Shachanti, that I may dwell, and the root for that word is shakana, which means to dwell or to reside. And it's the basis for the contemporary Hebrew word shikun, which means neighborhood. It's also related to the Hebrew mystical concept of Shekhinah. Shekhinah, which we have probably heard some about because it's become a popular word, is like the manifestation or the perceivable presence of God among humans. In the Kabbalistic tradition, Shekhinah is also seen as the feminine aspect of the divine, God's immanence in the world. And it's interesting to me that when we talk about a neighborhood, we're talking about a physical collection of houses and streets, etc. But we're also talking about a gathering place for holiness. And we would hope that our neighborhoods in some way are that. And it brings up the question to me, what makes our neighborhoods holy places, or what would make our neighborhoods holy places? But also, we can ask the same question about our shoals. What makes this particular building a holy place? And then the question is there any part of a synagogue that is more holy than any other part of a synagogue? Is the bima more holy than the gathering place near the door where people schmooze? And if so, why? Are we saying that the holiness is something that is place based and thus physical? Or are we saying that holiness is something that is within us that we could carry anywhere? The concept of going out to the woods to pray is basically saying, well, you don't necessarily need to have a designated place. Then why do we? We do because there's something in the physicality of those places that we decide are the bima or the synagogue. There's something in the physicality of those places that somehow either absorbs the prayers that we send up in that direction or are the source of the reminders for us of our own spiritual lives. So it's again another example of the connection between physical reality and spiritual reality. Comments or questions? Okay.
I think Christo has his hand up.
What?
Christo has
Oh,
his hand up.
There's kind of a disagreement in my synagogue as to which one of our rooms is the most holy.
yeah,
Uh, I wrote a Devar Haftarah for Shabbat Shekalim, and one opinion is that our board members who would meet in the library to go over the finances and other aspects, sometimes that's more holy than services in our sanctuary. When I taught the kids, and sometimes I still teach the kids, maybe that small cramped classroom where the kids are learning is more important than even the library or the board of directors rooms.
absolutely. Because the question, what makes something holy, to me, has something to do, well, what is it containing? Um, what's a room for? Now, most of you don't know this, but I used to be an architect. And in that life, there's this whole process before you design a building where you ask not only what is this room for, but what are the activities that are going to happen in this room? Thus, what is the room for? And only then, how can you design a space so it supports what the room is really for? So you can teach in a library and you can pray in a kids' classroom. There's nothing about the rooms themselves that defines the function. What happens is that we decide to call a particular room, a particular place based on what we decide the function is. I had a friend one time who decided he was going to do something radical. He tore down all of the interior walls in his house and said, now there's no longer anything called a bedroom. You can put the bed near the door. You can put the bed next to the toilet. You can put the sofa in the middle of next to the stove. You can take these functions and scramble them around in any way that you want. But what we tend to do, and it ties clearly into what is being discussed in this Torah portion, what we tend to do is to say, no, this is designated holy space. It's somehow more holy, even though we know rationally that that's not necessarily true.
Well, you said that the bima is different from the entryway where everybody's schmoozing. Well, I think when we're going in the entryway where people are schmoozing, we're not thinking about praying, but you step into the room where you're going to pray, and physically, but especially mentally, you're prepared for something else.
Right. And so the question is, well, is there such a thing as holy schmoozing? Um, when you're talking with people and you're relating to them, and maybe you're talking about the Torah portion, or maybe you're talking about what you had for breakfast. But the concept of saying that spiritual or access to God has physical limitations, that's a bit of a problem, because we say, Kol haaretz kavodo, all of the earth is filled with God's glory. So that means all of it. We say a prayer after successfully using the bathroom in the morning. It's part of the morning blessings. So it just is an interesting question to me of what are we doing by setting something apart that way. I can stop to share for that.
But God dwells among us all the time. No place should be special. And as a result, I think the reason we have a direction to build a sanctuary is because we need some physical manifestation of a holy space. It's hard for humans to contemplate the fact that God is all around us all the time.
Right. That's the Melochol Haaretz Kavodo. All the earth is filled with God's glory. And so actually the next piece of this verse, V'shachanti betocham. So here's this root, shechana, which is from Shekhinah, betocham, among them. So this word toch, which is translated among, really, it's related to the word for in, or literally means like within them. So this preposition means inside or within. It's used to indicate being inside something. And it's the same root we come across when we recite the prayer after reading Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam nata. But tochenu, within us. And that word within, it like this prayer expresses her gratitude that Torah is eternal and it's eternally promised, and it's physically a part of every human. Again, a connection between the physicality and the spirituality. So this root, toch, within or inside, it really implies an intimate connection, much more of a physical concept than among. If you think about a collection of people praying, and to think about the presence of God being among us all, feels different than saying it's within us all. Because within has a physicality, it's a within each of us. So it's a difference between building a dwelling place for God among them as a group versus within them, within each of them as individuals. Now, the other thing that's interesting is that when we say a dwelling place for God, it's a problematic concept in Jewish theology. Just as was pointed out, that God is everywhere. So what does it mean to construct a dwelling place for God? We're told to bring all of these precious objects, materials, to make a dwelling place for God when God is already everywhere. God doesn't need our embroidered curtains. And yet the Torah goes on and on and on about the importance and of the beauty of the embroidered curtains. So is that really a reminder? Because lest we forget, so we see the embroidered curtains and go, yes, God wants beauty. Or is there something else going on? So let me go back to that. So since we think that by Jewish theological thinking that God has no corporeality, no, God does not have a body. Although in medieval thought, there was a great deal of speculation about what God's body might look like, might be like. What are the measurements of God's arms? Now, it sounds silly for us to say now, but there's this very important medieval Kabbalistic work called Shiur Komah, where it's a whole list of speculations about the dimensions of different aspects of God's body. So, in terms of what we think about the history of Jewish thought, that's just a very interesting little piece. And it's also telling us that all throughout time, people have been wrestling with this same question. How do we deal with the fact that God is everywhere, and yet there are places in the physical universe that are different? One of the ways of referring to God is hamakom, which means the place. And so if we want to say that God is every place, then referring to God as hamakom, the place, is kind of an interesting way of recognizing that everywhere-ness, if that was word in English, which it probably has never been before right now. Let's see, I think there's one other quote that I wanted to talk about a little bit. Oh, this is the one from the Siddur, the prayer for planted eternal life within us, betochenu. So the word for within or inside, there's like 3 different words that mean within or inside. There's toch, there's emsa, and there's panima. So all of those are different aspects of being inside or within. And from what I can tell, this one, the toch one, is the most physical, intimate. When you talk about opening someone up and looking at their guts, the word that's used is toch. Okay. Later on in the same parsha, we get to the cherubim. And we're told God speaks to Moses from the sacred space between the 2 cherubim. Above the cover between the 2 cherubim that are over the Ark of the Covenant, I will meet with you and give you all my commands for the Israelites. So here we have a physical space that God is saying, I'm going to speak to you from this sacred space. Why is the space sacred? It's because it's between the cherubim. And I will meet you there and give you my commands for the Israelites. So a couple of things are fascinating to me, that they're talking about a space, but yet when you look at it, the words in the Torah, it's between. It's not an identified space. It's an empty place that's between 2 identified physical things, the cherubim. And so basically, they're saying God can dwell in empty spaces. I'm going to stop the share. Okay. So I think of the cherubim as kind of spiritual magnets, um, a magnet that has a force field, and that force field is existing between the two cherubim. And that force field, that empty space, is the source of divine inspiration. That's the place that God will speak from. And that means to me that what seems empty is actually full. And when we are praying, we become a kind of spiritual magnet ourselves. I think that this whole story about the importance of building a Mishkan is not so much about the physical Mishkan as it is about the spiritual Mishkan. That we were being asked, each of us, to create a space that is filled with the possibility of encountering God however we understand God, and that practices like meditation, where you're emptying your mind, are actually ways to connect to that very full emptiness, the emptiness of possibility, the emptiness of the possibility of inspiration. And that we have an internal Mishkan, and our job is to populate it with things that are precious to us, not physical objects of fancy embroidered curtains, but how do we populate our internal dwelling place for God to appear to us, for us to have a spiritual experience? We can populate that internal Mishkan with things that are precious to us. What do we value? What do we really value? And how do we capture those values and express them to people who matter to us? How do we make place for listening? I mean, if you think about that space between the cherubim, it's a sacred space for listening. And how do we in our lives make a sacred space for listening? Comments, questions?
Rabbi, I have something I'm thinking about as you're talking. AC here. Hello. Shabbat shalom. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's all these, the Keruvim and the Urim V'Tumim, like all these, the Mishkan, all these devices, places that all of a sudden exist for communication. It's like we've been out of cell service in the desert, and then all of a sudden it's like hotspots are everywhere, all bars, you can talk to God right, left, and center. And so I just wonder about the contrast. I mean, we've been spent all this time in slavery, and it's not until the people cry out, and then it's almost like there's been no contact.
Right. And then all of a sudden it seems like Moshe
Yeah.
said, wait, I think I found a path. I think I found a way. I've got the magic button to open up the possibility.
Right.
But
And I know it's an experience.
Go ahead.
So, well, I know that's an experience that we as human beings often have, where you feel that you're disconnected, there's no connection, you're crying out, you hear nothing in return, seemingly, and then it can be all of a sudden it's like the voice is there, or you feel connected, and there's obviously like a lesson in patience there, and endurance and perseverance, perhaps, in all this.
And it's not only patience and perseverance and a lot of patience and perseverance, but it's also we're required to make a contribution. We're required to say, what of me I offer in order to facilitate this connection. It's not like it's an automatic download to anybody who happens to wander by. There's something that we have to do to open up the channel, to create the sacred possibility of space. That's the place between the magnets. But we can't just sit back. I mean, if we did, we would be like the cherubim turning their heads the other direction. And they don't.
Yeah, hello. I just wanted to comment on a few ideas that came to me. This idea of creating a designated space for prayer actually raises, when there's prayer, good prayer, in a place, it raises the frequency. So it's good to designate certain places for an easier connection to a higher frequency, I guess, when you pray or when you're reaching for God. So, and it's in all religions, all religions, there are sacred spaces which allow for a better concentration of the human heart and human prayer to reach spiritual, connection. And I think what's really interesting for me from your talk today is that I did not differentiate until today, realize that I like to contribute to different things, different people, different causes. But there are ways in which if I contribute to somebody who's hungry or who's homeless, it's actually not an upward contribution, according to your definition. It's actually a shedding, it's actually a sharing. It's not necessarily like a noblesse oblige, reaching out to somebody who's lower, but it's sharing at a lateral level, at an equal sort of level. Whereas a contribution for spiritual purposes is really about my desire to reach upward. And I hadn't differentiated that before. I just had put them all in the same place, in terms of the active contribution. So I appreciate what you brought in today. It's, yeah, I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Well, that your comment just brought up to me the idea that when one contributes, say, to an organization that's trying to deal with homelessness, that in fact there is a contribution to something higher. It's a contribution toward our actively trying to create the kind of society that we think God wants. And so, I think in American society, we do have this tendency to separate the physical from the spiritual. Okay, it's not quite as much as, oh, I go to church on Sundays and the rest of the week, forget it. But there is a sense of, oh, I don't belong to a synagogue, so maybe I'm not really being a good Jew, for example. Or I give to the Jewish organizations, but I prioritize my giving. So I'm going to give to the organizations that help homeless people. They're equally important in terms of the function of what's the function of spirituality? Why should we recognize the importance of the divine in our world? It's partially because we want to increase our compassion. We want to increase our sense of holy possibility. We want to make a better world. And that's all God stuff to me. Speaking of unusual word, thought stuff. Other comments? So this is Shabbat Shkalim. This is traditionally the time that Jewish organizations ask for money. It's the first of 4 special Shabbatot before Pesach. And so it's interesting to me that this parsha, which is talking about contributions, is also when we talk about donations to build the temple. And what are we donating toward our own inner temples? What are we donating? What are we contributing to the possibilities of our own spiritual growth? And so some people I know, when it comes to Shabbat Shkalim, in addition to donating money, will say, I'm going to contribute something. I'm going to commit myself to contributing something toward building my own spiritual centeredness. And it might be something like, I'm going to commit to read something Jewish every Shabbat, whatever it is. I'm going to commit to randomly picking one of these books off my shelf and go back and rereading what it says. I'm going to commit myself to have conversation with some other Jewish person sometime this week about something that is not in the category of what did you have for lunch. So that's a very interesting way of saying how do we take this concept of donating something valuable and apply it to our own selves. What's valuable to us that might improve the strength of our own internal mishkan, our own internal place for holiness to dwell. Considering that holiness is everywhere, what does this do? It focuses our attention toward what's there all along, but that which we didn't necessarily pay attention to. Comments, questions?
Speak up, Rabbi Joe. You're muted. You have to unmute. There you go.
I thought I pushed it. It's 2 a.m. I'm somewhat malfunctioning. But
Excuses.
what's interesting also, Rabbi, is the amount of time and space that the book of Exodus gives to building, and the instructions for the Mishkan, for the tabernacle, and the actual building. And I think it's emphasizing the importance of our own effort in building that sacred space that you've been discussing. It's
Yeah,
almost it's over a third of the book.
right. When I thought about that, I thought, well, people need something physical because it's so hard to get to wrap your arms around the idea of something that is ethereal. And so you need to ground that ethereal in something that you can touch and measure. And that gets to be a challenge when we're talking about non-corporeal God concept. But the other question I always have when I get to this section is, do we really need to every year go through all of these intricate details over something that is not relevant to our everyday life? If we're not planning on building another temple, if we're not planning on building another physical sanctuary, why do we need to know about, the little pomegranate flowers at the bottom of the menorah? Um, and some of that is because we're valuing art, we're valuing human contribution to beautifying things. Some of it is telling us to pay attention to the details because God is in the details as well as everything else. And some of it, like I was thinking about the embroidery, it's like when you're making a talit and you're tying the tzitzit, all of our thoughts that are available at that time kind of get captured in the tzitzit. Like the Navajo concept of when you're weaving a rug, all of the thoughts that you have while you're weaving that rug are captured in that weaving. And so perhaps one of the reasons to continue every year to read about all of these details, even though we don't plan to reproduce them, is to at least appreciate the kind of sacred intention, the kavanah, that went into the construction of that edifice, and that can go into the construction of anything that we are building now, whether it's something physical or whether it's something spiritual. Other comments?
I actually have a favor to ask you along those lines, since we're Chodesh Tov Adar, and the month of Adar, we're obligated to find happiness and be besimcha, that perhaps you could give us a blessing that we should have success in that endeavor.
Well, I think the question is, can you make joy? We're told, Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, serve God with joy. And I think that is partially saying, oh, wait till you're happy and then serve God. But I think it's actually saying the other thing, that if you ivdu, which I don't really like to translate as serve or work, it's holy work, that if you do whatever it is you're doing in your life with some level of God awareness, with some level of, oh, this too is holy, then that will create joy. It's not easy to do, but setting aside, the tradition of setting aside time for prayer is part of that. The tradition of saying 100 blessings a day is part of that. I think anything that we can do in part of our daily lives to increase our awareness that the spiritual world is in fact not different from the world of what did I have for lunch. We can use the concept of we're raising sparks of holiness with every bite. We can say, let's increase our gratitude practice so that we put gratitude front and center in everything we do. I've had arguments with people about this, but in my nuclear family, we join hands and say Shehechianu before every meal. And then we squeeze hands according to however many people are in the circle at that time. So Thanksgiving, it might go 25, 26, 27. But the idea of pausing before eating every meal is an opportunity to say, wait a second, this food didn't just arrive. It came from somewhere. It's amazing that it's here. It's amazing that I have it. It's amazing that I have a body that can eat it, can appreciate it, can process it. It's amazing that I can think. It's amazing that the sense of appreciation is built in as a possibility for us to move toward joy. So, yes. So that verse about Ivdu et Hashem Simcha continues with the words Rananu, I believe. So it's another raising up, another way of saying, let's increase our possibility of joy, our possibility of contact, our possibility of having a spiritual experience wherever we happen to be, even in the far-flung places of the world. I think with that, I will say Toda Rabah. Thank you very much, all of you, for making time in your week to celebrate Shabbat, to celebrate each other, to celebrate the possibility of coming together to increase holiness and joy in the world. And since it is Shabbat, Shabbat Shalom, and Chodesh Tov, have a wonderful month and a wonderful Purim coming up and a wonderful Pesach coming up shortly thereafter.
Rabbi, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you all for coming. It's really good to see everybody.
Thank you.
Rabbi
Shabbat
Kantrowitz,
shalom.
I'm grateful for your time and your guidance this morning with us via Zoom.
Well, you're very welcome. I enjoy doing this, and I never know when I might see some of you again.
Well, I hope we see you soon in Albuquerque.
Okay, we'll do that.